If you have a Bible and you find it helpful, please turn in it to Acts chapter 20. This is where we will spend our time today. It's interesting, those songs that we've been singing this morning, at least to me, as I think about our country, and this has nothing to do with the sermon whatsoever. So it's interesting to me that we live in a world where we're having to reconcile two polar opposites. This country is a reconciliation of liberty on the one hand and law on the other. That's interesting to me, that somehow we've found that balance within sinful humanity that we can have both things, liberty and law, even though they are utterly polar opposites. That's pretty fascinating. And pretty much a testimony to the fact that the natural human condition is, underneath God as Lord, full liberty. That's interesting as well. This particular passage we're going to look at today records really about a year of traveling in Paul's life and him working in the work that he's doing as he goes about strengthening churches where he's already been, actually, at this point in his journey. He's on his way to Jerusalem. He's trying to take an offering to the church in Jerusalem, which is very poor. And we've talked about that before as to why they would be so impoverished. Being a Jewish church, most of the employment in Jerusalem was surrounding the temple. And if you became a Christian, a member of the Way, guess what? Your services are no longer needed in the temple employment. So a lot of people were unemployed and living hand to mouth in the Jerusalem church. And so Paul has collected a church. And that's amazing to me too, that they take all of these offerings from Gentile Greek churches with all of the tension between Jewish and Greek, and they're taking an offering from all of the Gentiles back to the Jewish church. That's pretty amazing. Paul is traveling by land instead of traveling by boat, which we'll get to in just a moment. Let's take a look at the text. I'll begin reading in verse 1. When the riot had ended, Paul sent for the disciples, and after encouraging them, said goodbye, and traveled and set out for Macedonia. He traveled through that area, speaking many words of encouragement to the people in the churches that were there, and finally arrived in Greece, where he stayed for 3 months. Because the Jews had plotted against him just as he was to sail for Syria, he decided to go back through Macedonia on foot. He was accompanied by Sopater, son of Pyrrhus, from Berea, Aristarchus and Secundus from Thessalonica, and Gaius from Derbe, Timothy, and also Tychicus and Trophimus from the province of Asia. These went on ahead with Paul and waited for us at Troas. But we sailed from Philippi. This is Luke speaking now. He's on the boat. We sailed from Philippi after the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and 5 days later joined the others at Troas, where we stayed for 7 days. On the first day of the week in Troas, we came together to break bread. Paul spoke to the people, and the next day he intended to leave, but he kept on talking until midnight. There were many lamps in the upstairs room where we were seated. Seated in a window was a young man named Eutychus, who was sinking into a deep sleep as Paul went on and on. That happens a lot here, doesn't it? I go on and people sink into a deep sleep. And so, when he was sound asleep, he fell to the ground from the 3rd story and was picked up dead. Paul went down and threw himself on the young man and put his arms around him and said, "Don't be alarmed, he's alive." Then he went upstairs and broke bread and ate. And after talking until daylight, we should try that here. Maybe not today. The people took the young man home alive and were greatly comforted. Paul's journey is not going to be straightforward. I mean, he could have gotten on the boat and they would have sailed straight across around the tip of the land and wound up in Syria, in Antioch of Syria, and then it would just been walked down to Jerusalem. He could have done that. But there was a plot, and this plot was pretty smart when you think about it. This was clearly a bunch of Jewish guys that wanted to do Paul in, because not only did the text say that, but they know that it's the time for the Feast of Unleavened Bread. They know that, and so they're thinking, Paul, he's going to be in a hurry to get back to Jerusalem, so here's our chance. So they get on the boat thinking Paul will be there and they can throw him overboard. And if you're out in the middle of the Aegean Sea there, who's going to know? Where's Paul? I don't know. I saw him a minute ago. Where'd he go? He's out there bobbing in the water. Nobody's going to know the difference. So it would have been easy to dispose of Paul. So the plot is discovered, and Paul says, I know what I'll do. I'll just walk. So he starts out on foot, and he goes back through the churches. And I have looked at every map I can look at of what this third missionary journey looked like. It is very hard to decipher because it says he goes back to Greece. Well, that's all the way around the bay back to another landmass. So I don't really understand. I've tried very desperately. I spent time last night looking at a map trying to figure out how Paul did this. Anyway, that's what it says he did. And this list of people that are with Paul, Luke gets on the boat and a couple with him. But the list of people that are with Paul, that's an important list. Those people are there because they are all representing various churches to take money back to the church in Jerusalem. They're all going as kind of emissaries from each church to take back this offering. Paul eludes the plot and arrives at Troas ahead of the boat, which makes some sense when you look at a map. It would have been a little easier to just walk there. And there's a week of meetings. Now, he didn't make it back to Jerusalem for the Feast of Unleavened Bread. That was his goal. At first, he wanted to go back. Now he's thinking, well, maybe I can make it back for Pentecost, but he's not going to make it for Passover. And they have a church service on the first day of the week in a person's home. There's a meal. Now, you have to realize that the church services in most settings, not only were they in homes, they were mostly at night. The reason for that is most people had to work during the day. They couldn't attend a church service. People lived by the sun. It was from sun up to sundown. You worked all that period of time. And so the one day of the week, the first day of the week, when they would have church services, most of them were at night. This way, if you were a slave, you didn't have any time off. So the only time you weren't working was when the sun was down, if you were a slave that worked in the fields. And so they come and they have what they call the agape meal. We have communion. You get a piece of bread and you stick it in the cup and you eat that and try to get it down and then you move back to your seat. They had a full meal. I mean, they served it up, potluck. Everybody brought food. Everybody was fed. And this would probably be the only real meal that a lot of those slaves got all week. So for them, this was a big deal. And just imagine, the people who were there, you had wealthy Jewish people and wealthy Gentiles, the homeowners, and then you had the slaves, and you had proselytes, and you had all of these people from all kinds of different countries, different nationalities, different languages, different socioeconomic backgrounds, and they were all gathered as one. And in that day, that didn't happen. You didn't sit down at a meal with slaves and eat. Here they all are eating. There's so much going on here that speaks to what the effect of the Spirit of God living in people does to people. It changes everything about them. It makes them love people they would never otherwise love. Kind of like us. It makes us love people we might never otherwise love. So they have a meal. All right, it's dark. It's probably 8 or 9 o'clock. This is in the springtime, so they're probably going to eat. And then Paul starts to speak. And it says he spoke until midnight. Gosh. I can understand. I mean, for me, when it gets to be at my house, we get up at 5:20. So by 9 o'clock, man, I'm done. I really am not interested in staying awake any longer at all. I cannot imagine sitting there and listening to somebody till midnight. Now, you have to realize, we do the fifth Sunday here. And we have the meeting where all the churches get together, and there's a meal, a real meal, a big one too. I mean, it's almost like all the Fifth Sunday churches try to outdo each other. Who can make, you had 30 cakes, at yours we're going to have 40 cakes. And that's how everybody's impressed with the fact that we've got all this food. There was a conversation amongst the pastors as to how we should arrange the meetings. And one of them said, hey, I got a great idea. Let's have the meal first. And I said, I don't think that's a good idea at all. I said, first place, number one, 40% of the crowd that comes is going to leave before the meeting because the food's in them and they're gone. They're just going to take the stomach full of food home with them and that's going to be it. They're not even going to be in the meeting. I said, that's the first problem. The second problem is, I don't know how it is for you, but if I've eaten a really big meal, I'm just going to be a head on, those things you put on the back of the car and their heads kind of bobble around. That's what I'm going to be in 10 minutes if I eat a big meal at nighttime and then have to sit through something. So picture what they're doing here. They're in this third-story room of an adobe house. It's all mud. It's hot. There are no electric lights, so all they got are lamps burning all over. The room is absolutely packed because Paul's a kind of a rock and roll star for this church. You've got a bunch of people in there where probably 60% of them are physical laborers. They work with their bodies every day. So they've worked all day. They've got a big meal in them. It's way after dark. They're sitting there. Paul's already been speaking for 3 or 4 hours. The upper room, you ever go up in your attic in the summertime? Which room of your house is the hottest room? I mean, the top floor. They used to build houses here in the South. You go into some of these old Victorians, they're 12-foot ceilings. Why? Because you want to keep all that heat up there where I'm sitting on the couch, I can't feel it. They're in the upper room, the farthest room they can get in. There's a huge crowd. There are lamps burning. Everybody's packed in tight. All those 98.6s in one spot. Everybody's just burning. I mean, it's got to be really hot, sticky, and late, and dark, and I'm full. So midnight comes, and Eutychus is smart. I've seen pictures of these houses, and they had windows. The windows had no glass. They just had kind of wooden shutters on them. And the window would be all the way to the floor. So Eutychus, he's a smart guy. He says, I'm going to sit where there's some fresh air. I'm going to sit in this window. And he does, but even with sitting in the window, it just takes too much out of him. He falls asleep. That reminds me of something. Don't fall asleep. Think for a minute. I can think of several people in the scripture who fell asleep and bad things happened. The first one that comes to my mind is Adam. I mean, look what happened when... Don't fall asleep. Surgery. I mean, he dozes off and look what happened to him. And then you got Samson. Look what happened to him when he fell asleep. He woke up bald. And, of course, things happened to him that he probably would have rather not happen.
If Adam hadn't fallen asleep, Samson wouldn't have been as bad.
That's right. That's right. Ooh, I'm going to stay away from that. We'll talk about that later. So most texts, when Eutychus falls and everybody runs downstairs and Paul falls on him, it reminds me of Elisha and the Shunammite woman's son. Her only son that she'd prayed for, and he dies. Remember that? He goes out in the field, his head, my head, my head. The father sends the son back to the Shunammite woman, and the son dies. And Elisha comes and says he's not dead. He lays down on him, prays for him, and he's raised from the dead. This is similar. Paul goes down and lays prostrate on this guy, says his life is still in him. Most of the texts that I could find are kind of ambiguous. We're not sure if he really was dead, but everybody thought so, right? I mean, he's fallen 16, 18 feet to the pavement. He's not moving. He doesn't seem to be breathing. So we'll take him as dead. Paul falls down on him, and he's alive. And they all go back upstairs. Well, everybody's awake now. I mean, if you saw that, everybody, wow, look at what so Paul says, I'm going to take advantage of it. I'm just going to go on till the next day speaking. And so he speaks. I'm not going to do that today. But there's something here in this text that I find as a principle. You can look at texts two different ways. You can look at them and say, what's the history and what information should I extract from it via the history? You can also look at texts and say, what would I extract from it via a principle? And there is a principle here. And I want us to think for just a minute, what do we find in life to be enlivening and exciting? What things in life? Just think of the things in your life and mine wherein we find ourselves enlivened and excited about what it is we're going to do. I can think of lots of things that I really find myself stoked about. Tyler and I, we play music together sometimes. I get really excited when I've got 4th of July is my birthday, and so I get the whole day to sit out in that little 8-foot by 8-foot room that I've got my guitars in. I get to spend the whole day out there. So don't ask me to do anything that day. Don't get sick. Don't go to the hospital. Don't wreck your car. Don't do anything because I'm busy that day. But think about the thing that you find exciting. And then think about us in here today and whether or not this is exciting in that sense. Or even is it fulfilling? Or even is it something that draws us out? Or even is it something that we're interested in? There is a different kind of drowsiness for us. The Eutychus got sleepy. And physical drowsiness, nobody should ever feel bad about that. Look, I go to these Piedmont meetings. And the Piedmont meetings have usually 2 people speak. And by the time we get a third of the way through the second guy, Rip's getting drowsy. You know, I'm doing stuff. Do you do stuff when you get sleepy sitting there? Like I'll snap my head around like that. Or I'll try to open my eyes really wide. Or I'll scratch something that's not really itching. Anything I can do to move so that I can enliven myself so that I can pay attention. But this is a bigger question than that. That's just physical stuff. We're just physical beings. We get sleepy, we get itchy, we get tired, we get cranky, we get a headache, whatever. That's all part of just being a human being. I'm talking about something deeper than that. What about the distinction between what excites us in life and the excitement we do or don't feel about our walk with the Lord? Let's think about that for just a minute. I want to read something for you, and I don't do this very often, but this is so powerful for me. This is C.S. Lewis's The Screwtape Letters. Anybody ever read that? A couple of people have read it. Okay. I think Lewis, I said this to everybody that I talk to, I'm so foamed up about C.S. Lewis, and I say, I think God put him on this earth to do one thing, and that was write these things that he wrote. But I want to read from it. If you don't know anything about Screwtape, let me explain it. Screwtape is a demon. That's the demon's name. He's an uncle. He's a senior demon in hell. And he's writing letters to a junior demon named Wormwood, who is his nephew. And he's trying to teach Wormwood how to tempt the humans. The humans are called the patient. And anytime they speak of God, they call him the enemy. And it's always in capital letters, the enemy. So with all that in mind, listen to this first text where Screwtape is advising Wormwood as to how it is he should tempt his patient. He says, you can make him do nothing at all for long periods of time. You can keep him up late at night, not partying and carousing, but staring at a dead fire in a cold room. He says, as one of my own patients said on his arrival down here, that means he's gotten one down there, he says, I now see that I spent most of my life doing neither what I ought to do or even what I like to do. The Christians describe the enemy as one without whom nothing is strong. And nothing is very strong. Strong enough to steal away a person's best years, not in sweet sin, but in a dreary flickering of the mind over it knows not what and cares not why, in the gratification of curiosity so weak that the person is only half aware of the curiosity, in the drumming of fingers and the clicking of heels, in the whistling of tunes that they really don't like, or in the long, dim corridors of partyings and reveries and carousing that don't even have good lust or ambition to give them a relish, but which once chance association has started them, the creature is too weak and fuddled to shake them off. Now think about what that's saying. I love Pink Floyd. I know that's such a right turn, isn't it? I love Pink Floyd. I love the song Time, wherein the whole thrust of the song is that 10 years have got behind you. No one told you when to run. You missed the starting gun. That the whole of life is spent doing things a lot of the time that just don't have any meaning. They don't do anything. They don't accomplish anything. We don't even really like them. I think a lot of TV is like that. I mean, they've done studies. They hook up all these electrodes to people and put them in front of TV to watch TV. And they find that people are at the edges of hypnosis mentally. that they're just watching the things and they're not really connecting with what's there. It's just something to pass the time. You know, we say that, don't we? We say, I'm going to spend time. That is the most literal statement a human being can make. Because you and I, let's face it, we've got birth and death. And that in between is all there is. So when you and I spend time, that's exactly what we're doing. We're spending it. It never comes back. You hear people say, oh, I'm going to save some time. No, you're not. That time's clicking away no matter how efficiently you're moving, the time is going by. And we lose it forever. Never to regain it. That means something. And how much of our time is spent doing things that really don't even matter. Or even fun. He goes on. He says, you will say that these are small sins. Doubtless, like all young tempters, Wormwood, you're anxious to be able to report spectacular wickedness in your patient. But do remember, the only thing that matters is the extent to which you separate that person from the enemy. The only thing that matters is how much of what we're doing separates us from God. As far as the demonic world is concerned, that's the only concern they have. What are we doing that pulls us away from that sense of God's presence and excitement for Him? It's irrelevant as long as it works. That's all it's got to do is work. He goes on. It doesn't matter how small the sins are, provided their cumulative effect is to edge your patient away from the light and out into the nothing. Murder is no better than cards, if cards will do the job. You know, that sense of just passing time. Doesn't even matter what we're doing. And he closes this way. He said, the safest road to hell is the gradual one. The gentle slope, soft underfoot, without sudden turnings, without surprises, without milestones, without signposts. Your affectionate Uncle Screwtape. I think Lewis was onto something. I really do. And we live in a culture that numbs us to the things of God constantly. Everything about this culture is noisy, and it causes us to concentrate on things. Look, it's not when we hear that, my fear is that we have an association that we make instantly. We say, well, that means, Rip, that what you're saying to me is that I need to be in my Bible and I need to pray more and do all those things. Maybe, but that's not what I'm talking about. You know, we have to work, we have to do things, we have to wash dishes, we got to vacuum, we got to do our job every day, we've got to do the things that are necessary to keep life going. God knows that. But where is He in it? Where is He in it? Is He in those things? Or are we just, that's the time we pass the time doing this, and now we're in church doing that? That is not the Christian life at all. It is not. God wants to be involved in every sphere of our living. Think of it. If you've got a really, really good friend, don't you want to spend time with that friend doing whatever? It's just fun to be there with that friend. Do you think God is any different? He wants to spend His life, our lives, with us. So everything we're doing matters. There is no sacred and mundane once a person says yes to Jesus. Everything becomes sacred. And just remember, you know, Samson, he dozed off. He thought life was really good. And I love what it says in Judges. It says he fell asleep, you know, on Delilah's lap. And of course she took advantage of that and shaved his hair because he'd let her know that that was the source of his strength. And it says, Samson awoke from his sleep and said to himself, I'll just get up and go out at other times as I'd have before and shake the fetters off my arms. But what Samson didn't know was that the Lord had departed from him. Wow. I wonder about, for you and me, and I say this, please don't mishear me. I never do sermons, I hope I don't, wherein I'm saying you. I'm always saying us, because I'm as guilty of any of this as anybody in this room. Suffering from the same things you suffer from. I go to work and I get hot and angry and think to myself, I don't feel like being here, and I've got to spend the rest of the day here, but where's the Lord in that, you see? There's a place for Him to occupy that time. I think it's easy for us to sing. For instance, take it this way. Do we sing the hymns that we sing because we like the tune? Right? I've got friends who tell me about this particular artist or that particular artist, and they would talk about how much they like gospel music. Yeah, but what about what they're saying in the music? How connected are we with what we're looking at the hymn and singing? The music's great, but what about what's being said? I think it's easy for us to attend, and we can come to church because that's what we do every Sunday. And to go through the service and yet not engage ourselves in it because we're just waiting for the time to pass before we go on with more interesting things. That's very possible. Some of that may be my fault. I don't know. I remember reading about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and he said this. It was said of him by one of his students. He said, what I found so fascinating by Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and you may not know who that is, he was a German Lutheran pastor. He came to America, taught at a seminary here, and then wanted to go back to Germany when Hitler arose to power because he felt such compassion for his kinfolk. And he went back to Germany and formed up what was known as the Confessing Church, which was a church that was illegal in Germany. It wasn't the state-sanctioned church. And he was actually part of the plot to assassinate Adolf Hitler, for which Dietrich Bonhoeffer wound up in a concentration camp, and 2 weeks before the camp was liberated, he was hung. But he taught in his seminary, and one of the students said, what I loved about Bonhoeffer was, when it came time for our preaching class, the preaching students would go up there, and Bonhoeffer would open his Bible, and he would sit there, and he would follow that sermon no matter how bad it was, because he wanted to see what God might say to him in that moment through that person. He was engaged. He said he listened to the worst sermons you could imagine as though God Himself were speaking. For me, I can only speak for myself. What I want is, I want God to awaken me. I want God to enliven me. And it's not a bad thing to pray that God would enliven us and awaken us to see the difference between everything that we see around us and what He's actually doing and what He would call us to do and be. It's a worthy prayer. And it's not just a one-time, Lord, help me see what You're doing better, or Lord, fill me up. It's a pursuit. Are we willing to make that a pursuit in our lives? I don't know where everybody is here today, but if you've got anything you want to ask me a question, you want to talk to me about this church, you want to pray with me, I'll stay as long as it takes as we